There is a number that most Americans have never been told, and even fewer have ever thought to ask about. It is not published in headlines. It does not trend on social media. It does not appear in political debates or campaign speeches. But it is one of the most important numbers in the modern financial world, and it has been changing quietly, steadily, and without interruption for the past 3 years. That number is a percentage of global transactions still conducted in U.S. dollars. In the year 2000, that figure stood at roughly 73%. By 2010, it had fallen to 64%. By 2020, it sat just above 59%. And today, as we move through the final weeks of 2025, it hovers somewhere near 51%. That may not sound like a collapse. It may not even sound like a crisis. But what it represents is a slow, methodical unwinding of the single most powerful economic advantage the United States has held for nearly 8 decades. And if history has taught us anything, it is this. When the world stops needing your currency, it stops needing your debt, your markets, and eventually your stability. The U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency not because of military dominance or political ideology, but because of trust. In 1944, while much of Europe lay in ruins and the global economy teetered on the edge of total collapse, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and made a decision that would shape the next century. They agreed that the U.S. dollar, backed at that time by gold, would become the anchor of international trade. Oil would be priced in dollars. Commodities would be traded in dollars. Central banks would hold dollars as reserves. And in return, the United States would ensure liquidity, stability, and access to the deepest capital markets the world had ever seen. It was not a perfect system, but it worked. And for decades, it gave the United States a privilege that no other nation in history has enjoyed: the ability to print money and have the rest of the world accept it as payment. But that privilege was never guaranteed. It was conditional, and the condition was simple. As long as the world believed the dollar was stable, reliable, and backed by the strongest economy on earth, they would continue to use it. The moment that belief began to crack, the entire structure would begin to shift. That shift is no longer theoretical. It is happening now, in real time, across multiple continents, and in ways that most people will not notice until it's far too late. In 2023, China and Brazil finalized a trade agreement that allowed them to settle transactions in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. In early 2024, Saudi Arabia announced it would begin accepting yuan for oil sales, breaking a 50-year tradition that had effectively underwritten U.S. economic dominance in the Middle East. By the summer of that same year, India and Russia had expanded their rupee-ruble exchange system, allowing billions of dollars worth of trade to occur outside the traditional dollar-based infrastructure. These are not isolated incidents. They are not political stunts or temporary experiments. They are deliberate, coordinated moves by some of the largest economies in the world to reduce their dependence on a currency they no longer fully trust. And the reason they no longer trust it is because the United States has spent the last 2 decades doing exactly what every failing empire does when it starts to lose control. It has weaponized its currency, printed unprecedented amount of money, and assumed that the rest of the world would simply continue to go along with it. But the rest of the world is not going along with it. They are quietly, systematically, building alternatives. The BRICS nations, which now include Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and as of 2024, several new members including Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, have been working for years on a shared currency system designed to compete directly with the dollar. They have not launched it yet. They have not needed to, because the erosion is already happening without it. Every time a major economy signs a bilateral trade deal that excludes the dollar, every time a central bank diversifies its reserves away from U.S. treasuries, every time an oil-producing nation agrees to accept payment in another currency, the global financial system takes one more step away from the structure that has kept American wealth insulated from the consequences of its own fiscal recklessness. And most Americans have no idea it is happening. This is not the first time in history that a dominant currency has lost its status. It is not even the first time it has happened to a nation that believed itself to be invincible. Before the U.S. dollar, The British pound sterling held the position of global reserve currency for more than a century. At its peak, the pound was used in nearly 60% of all international trade. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land and population. London was the financial capital of the world, and British banks set the terms for global commerce. But by the end of World War II, the pound had lost its dominance. Not because Britain was defeated militarily, but because it had overextended itself financially. It had borrowed too much, printed too much, and relied too heavily on the belief that its currency would always be accepted simply because it always had been. When that belief faded, the pound collapsed in value, and Britain entered a period of economic decline that it has never fully recovered from. The same thing happened to the Dutch guilder in the 17th century. It happened to the Spanish real in the 16th century. And it is happening now in slow motion to the US dollar. The difference this time is scale. When the pound sterling lost its reserve status, the global economy was a fraction of the size it is today. International trade was slower, less interconnected, and easier to reorganize. Today, the world economy is deeply integrated, with trillions of dollars moving across borders every single day. The dollar is not just a currency. It is the infrastructure. It is embedded in contracts, debt instruments, supply chains, and financial systems that span the entire planet, which means that when it begins to lose its position, the consequences will not be limited to exchange rates or trade balances. They will ripple through every layer of the economy, from the price of groceries to the value of retirement accounts, from the cost of borrowing money to the ability of the government to fund itself without triggering inflation or default. And the people who will feel it first are not the wealthy. They never are. The people who will feel it first are the ones who have spent their entire lives being told that their dollars are safe, that their savings are protected, and that the system is designed to work in their favor. There's a pattern that appears before every major financial collapse, and it is almost always the same. It begins with overconfidence. The markets are strong. The economy appears stable. People believe that the current system, however flawed, is simply too big to fail. Then comes the first crack. It is usually small, easily dismissed, and quickly rationalized by experts who assure everyone that the fundamentals are sound. But the crack does not disappear. It widens, slowly at first, then faster. And as it widens, the insiders begin to move. They do not announce their moves. They do not warn the public. They simply begin shifting their assets, hedging their positions, and quietly preparing for what they know is coming. This is a stage where most people are still unaware. They see the headlines, they hear the reassurances, and they assume that if something truly serious were happening, someone would tell them. But no one does, because by the time the collapse becomes undeniable, the insiders have already protected themselves, and the average person is left holding the risk. We saw this exact pattern in 1929. For years leading up to the crash, the stock market had been climbing to unprecedented heights. Speculation was rampant, debt was cheap, and everyone from bankers to shoeshine boys believed they had discovered a new era of permanent prosperity. But beneath the surface, the economy was fragile. Corporate earnings were stagnating. Consumer debt was rising. And the wealth that appeared to be growing was largely built on leverage and expectation rather than real production. When the market finally collapsed in October that year, it did not happen because of a single event or a sudden shock. It happened because the underlying structure had been hollowed out, and the moment confidence wavered, the entire system came apart. Millions of people lost their savings. Banks failed by the thousands. And the economy entered a depression that would last more than a decade. The warning signs had been there for years, but most people did not see them because they were not looking. The same thing happened in 1987, when the stock market dropped more than 22% in a single day, wiping out trillions of dollars in wealth in a matter of hours. It happened again in 2000, when the dot-com bubble burst and revealed that entire sectors of the economy had been built on nothing more than hype and speculation. And it happened most recently in 2008, when the housing market collapsed and exposed a financial system so over-leveraged and so dependent on the assumption of endless growth that it nearly brought down the entire global economy. In every case, the collapse was preceded by the same sequence of events. Overconfidence, a small crack, insider movement, public denial, and then suddenly collapse. The only difference between those crashes and what is happening now is at this time, the crack is not in a single market or a single sector. It is in the currency itself. And when a currency fails, it does not just affect stock prices or real estate values. It affects everything. The mechanics of how a reserve currency loses its status are not complicated, but they are almost never explained in plain terms, because doing so would require acknowledging reality that most governments are unwilling to admit. A reserve currency works only as long as other countries are willing to hold it, and they are willing to hold it only as long as they believe it will retain its value. The moment they begin to doubt that, they start looking for alternatives, not aggressively, not all at once, but steadily, persistently, and with the understanding that they cannot afford to be the last ones holding a devalued asset. This is what has been happening with the dollar for the past several years. Central banks around the world have been quietly reducing their holdings of U.S. treasuries. They have been buying gold at rates not seen since the 1970s. They have been negotiating trade agreements in their own currencies. And they have been doing all of this without making dramatic announcements because they do not want to trigger a panic. But the data is there. The trends are undeniable. And the implications are unavoidable. When a country holds U.S. dollars as reserves, it is essentially lending money to the United States. It is trusting that those dollars will be worth something in the future. But what happens when the U.S. government continues to borrow trillions of dollars every year? When it prints money to cover deficits that have no realistic path to repayment? And when it uses its currency as a tool of foreign policy, freezing assets and imposing sanctions on nations that fall out of favor? What happens is that trust erodes. And when trust erodes in a reserve currency, the world does not collapse overnight. It simply begins to reorganize itself around a new system. That reorganization is happening now, and the people who will be hurt the most are not the ones making the decisions. They're the ones who have spent their entire lives saving in dollars, investing in dollar-denominated assets, and trusting that the system will protect them. The question that most people are not asking is what happens to their savings when the dollar is no longer the dominant global currency. The answer is not simple, but it is predictable. When demand for dollars decreases, the value of the dollar decreases. When the value of the dollar decreases, everything priced in dollars becomes more expensive. Imports cost more. Energy costs more. Food costs more. And because the United States imports far more than it exports, the impact is immediate and widespread, but the effects go deeper than just prices. When the dollar loses value, so do dollar-denominated assets. Bonds lose value. Stocks denominated in dollars lose purchasing power. Retirement accounts that are invested in U.S. markets lose real wealth, even if the nominal numbers stay the same. And because most Americans hold the majority of their wealth in these exact types of assets, the decline in the dollar represents a direct transfer of wealth away from ordinary savers and toward those who have already moved their money into harder assets, foreign currencies, and inflation-protected instruments. This is not speculation. This is how currency devaluation has always worked. In every economy, in every era, the Roman Empire debased its currency by reducing the silver content in its coins. And within a generation, the price of goods had increased by more than 200%. The Weimar Republic printed money to pay its debts after World War I. And within 2 years, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Zimbabwe printed money to cover its deficits in the early 2000s. And by 2008, inflation had reached such absurd levels that the currency became worthless, and the entire economy had to be rebuilt using foreign money. The United States is not Zimbabwe. It is not Weimar Germany. But it is following the same playbook. It is printing money at unprecedented rates. It is running deficits that have no clear path to sustainability. And it is assuming that because the dollar has been a reserve currency for so long, it will simply remain so indefinitely. That assumption is the same one that every failing empire has made, and it has never been correct. What makes this moment different from previous financial crises is that the erosion is happening at the structural level. In 2008, the crisis was centered in housing and banking. The government could step in, bail out the banks, and stabilize the system because the dollar itself was still trusted. But if the crisis is in the dollar, there is no bailout. There is no institution large enough or credible enough to step in and restore confidence in a currency that the world is actively moving away from. The Federal Reserve can raise interest rates. It can lower them. It can buy assets or sell them. But it cannot force other countries to continue using dollars. It cannot stop China from settling trade in yuan. It cannot prevent Saudi Arabia from accepting alternative currencies for oil. And it cannot undo the decades of fiscal mismanagement that have brought the system to this point. The tools that worked in previous crises do not work when the crisis is in the currency itself. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. There is a psychological component to currency collapse that is rarely discussed, but is absolutely critical to understanding how these events unfold. Currency is not backed by gold anymore. It is not backed by any physical commodity. It is backed entirely by belief, by the collective agreement that a piece of paper or a number on a screen represents value. As long as that belief holds, the system functions. But the moment that belief begins to crack, the system does not slowly decline. It accelerates, because once people start to doubt the value of their currency, they begin trying to get rid of it. They buy assets. They convert to foreign currencies. They hoard goods. And the more people do this, the faster the currency loses value, which causes even more people to panic, which accelerates the decline even further. This feedback loop has been documented in every hyperinflationary collapse in history, and it always begins the same way, with a small group of people realizing that the game has changed, and then acting on that realization before everyone else catches on. The insiders are already moving, not loudly, not visibly, but they are moving. Corporate treasuries are diversifying their currency holdings. Hedge funds are increasing their allocations to commodities and foreign assets. High net worth individuals are shifting money into real estate, precious metals, and offshore accounts. They are not doing this because they believe the dollar will collapse tomorrow. They are doing it because they understand probabilities. They understand that when the risk is existential, even a small chance of catastrophe is worth hedging against. And they understand that by the time the majority realizes what is happening, it will be too late to protect themselves. This is how wealth is preserved during times of monetary transition, not by waiting for certainty, but by acting on the early signals that most people dismiss as noise. The problem is that most people do not have access to those signals. They do not follow central bank reserve data. They do not track bilateral trade agreements. They do not study the history of reserve currency transitions. They simply trust that the system will continue to work the way it always has. And by the time they realize it will not, the wealth transfer will already be complete. The timeline for this decline is not measured in days or weeks. It is measured in years. But those years are compressing. What took a decade in previous currency transitions is happening in half that time now. Because information moves faster, capital moves faster, and the interconnectedness of the global economy means that decisions made in Beijing or Riyadh or New Delhi have immediate consequences in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. The dollar is not going to disappear, but it is going to lose its dominance. And when it does, the standard of living that Americans have enjoyed for the past 70 years, the ability to borrow cheaply, to import inexpensively, to live beyond their means without immediate consequences, all of that will change. Not because of a political decision, not because of a war or a natural disaster, but because the rest of the world has decided that it no longer needs to play by the rules that were written in 1944. The people who will be hurt the most are the ones who are least prepared. The retirees who have spent their entire lives saving in dollars, trusting that their pensions and Social Security will be enough. The middle-class families who have invested in index funds and 401ks, believing that the market will always recover. The young workers who are just beginning to save, who have been told that time is on their side. That compound interest will make them wealthy if they just stay disciplined and keep contributing. All of them are exposed, not because they made bad decisions, but because the system they trusted was built on assumptions that are no longer true. And the realization of that exposure is coming. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, grinding recognition that the dollars they hold are buying less, that their savings are not growing fast enough to keep up with rising costs, and that the future they plan for is slipping further out of reach with each passing year. This is not a story about the end of America. It is a story about the end of a specific kind of American privilege, one that was never guaranteed and was always conditional. The United States will remain a powerful nation. It will remain wealthy by global standards. But it will no longer enjoy the unique advantage of being able to print money and have the rest of the world accept it without question. That era is ending, and the transition will be painful, not because it is unprecedented, but because it is exactly what history has always predicted. Every empire that has ever existed has eventually faced the same reckoning. The Spanish Empire, the Dutch Republic, the British Empire, all believed their dominance was permanent. All were wrong. And the mechanism of their decline was always the same. They overextended. They borrowed too much. They printed too much. And they assumed the world would continue to accept their currency simply because it always had, until one day it did not. The question now is not whether this transition will happen. The data is already clear. The trends are already in motion. The question is whether you will recognize it in time to prepare, not to panic. Not to abandon everything and retreat into some imaginary bunker, but to understand that the rules are changing and that the strategies that worked for the past 50 years may not work for the next 50. To recognize that holding wealth in dollars alone, in a world that is actively moving away from the dollar, is a risk that previous generations never had considered, and to act on that recognition before the majority does. Because by the time the evening news is explaining what a reserve currency is and why it matters, the insiders will have already finished repositioning their wealth, and the average person will be left trying to protect themselves in a market that has already repriced everything. The collapse of reserve currency is not a sudden event. It is a process, a slow, inevitable erosion of trust that compounds over time until the system that everyone assumed was permanent is revealed to have been fragile all along. We are in the middle of that process now. Most people do not see it, but the signs are there, in the trade agreements, in the central bank data, in the quiet diversification happening in boardrooms and government offices around the world, and in the simple, undeniable fact that the world is no longer willing to accept the dollar on faith alone. The privilege is ending. The question is whether you will see it in time.